My work is, let me just say a little bit, I'm not an archivist. I don't work in the archives per se. I am a digital media scholar, and I work in an information studies department. I have a PhD in library and information science. And so I think of my work around kind of records and representation and infrastructures of the internet as being very conversant with people who are doing work around digital archives, because in many ways I think our work is complementary. And so today I'm going to talk a bit about some new work that I'm developing and hopefully we'll be publishing soon. And so I'll just kind of get in, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts as I develop this work. I've been thinking about the circulation of surveillance videos and images of African Americans who are murdered or detained by police and private security, and this has really been enhanced by the spectacle of new media. The new research that I'm sharing today, building upon my previously published paper about Trayvon Martin in The Black Scholar, argues that media spectacles are created by surveillance records to foster news ratings and advertising revenues at the expense of a national conversation and public policy addressing racial injustice. Since I wrote that piece for The Black Scholar, many new resources have been allocated in service of other forms of record keeping by the state. Indeed, a newfound interest in clamoring for increased surveillance in the form of body cameras has escalated, fueled by the requests from the families of victims of police violence and murder. In this new work, I'm taking a critical view on information records like surveillance videos as a fundamental part of emerging narratives of public safety. I use critical discourse analysis to make sense of the role of surveillance videos in the recent spate of state-sanctioned deaths of African Americans. By analyzing media discourses that obscure the surveillance practices, I'm investigating how internet records work in service of power or domination among various social groups. More research is needed to situate the politics of technology in surveillance video and images in a broader social and political context. And this work contributes to incorporating thinking beyond the violence captured in video to include the matter of use of state records vis-a-vis police dash cams and citizen documentation. Ultimately, I examined the way surveillance records are used to instantiate a right to fear blackness. Lisa Cacho talks about this in her work, as a means of upholding the racial contract. And this is an argument that Charles Mills makes, and I'll talk about here in a moment, while simultaneously provoking inquiries by community members and families into violent racialized death in the United States. Theoretically, in my work, I'm revisiting Guy Debord, who offers relevant thinking in the examination of the spectacle of Black Death. In his 1967 book, The Society of the Spectacle, he articulates a framework for thinking about the nature of society, its culmination as a life of commodification, and the spectacle that society has become as a result of capitalism and alienation. For Debord, mass media was the ultimate or most profound manifestation or culmination of superficiality. Using this mode of analysis, the spectacle, in the context of viral videos about Black Death, means we consider their commodified status, and how the mass media portrayed the stories of the subjects. I'm also invoking the work of critical archival scientists Anne Gilliland and Michelle Caswell, whose influential work on the role of records in the recognition of human rights abuses has significantly shifted the field of information studies to consider the ways that records, both real and imagined, play a meaningful role in the recognition of atrocity. They say, conjured by the unattainable hopes for closure by survivors and victims' families, such imaginary documents are bound by their impossibility. They are always out of grasp, falsely promising to make sense of the nonsensical, always emerging on an intangible horizon. They will never serve as legal evidence, nor provide answers about past atrocities. Yet despite these limitations, imaginary documents help us both broaden our definition of human rights documentation to include the affective needs of survivors and victims' families, and to reconceptualize archives as institutions that can make meaning out of past atrocity when legal systems are unable to or perceived to fail to administer justice. I use their theorization of the expected intervention that imagined evidence that circulates on the internet might bring forward, and apply it to the desire for video evidence when Black people are murdered, and the imaginary that recorded videos or photos taken by bystanders will bring about justice. This imaginary of the role of records as a source of evidence is particular to the bodies that are both subject of such videos, the creators of such, and the ability of these records to be made visible. This hope for the possibility of records has to be questioned when the real records are dismissed in official judicial processes. In this case, the records and the potential for records to be created in the future serves as documentation for a possibility of recognition. So let me frame my talk today by thinking about the ways that we think about rights and inclusion or recognition. And here I'm using the work of Charles Mills in his book, The Racial Contract. Mills is taking up and directly challenging the social and political philosophies that undergird Western societies, particularly stemming from the Enlightenment. I think this work is important as it can help us think about the entire system of so-called freedoms and rights that are not only central to the way we think about the hierarchies of racial control and our resistance to them, but also the way we think about how these philosophies extend to the projects of our society. My previous work on this, and my new book, Algorithms of Oppression, which is due out later this year, has been concerned with property frameworks that control and misrepresent Black people, particularly Black women and girls, online. I think that Mill's theorizing of the social contract as a racial contract helps us understand the ways in which rights are extended to some, but not all, human beings. He says, one could say then as a general rule that white misunderstanding, misrepresentation, evasion, and self-deception on matters related to race are among the most pervasive mental phenomena of the past few hundred years, a cognitive and moral economy psychically required for conquest, colonization, and enslavement. And these phenomena are in no way accidental, but prescribed by the racial contract, which requires a certain schedule of structured blindness and opacities in order to establish and maintain the white polity. So Mills is arguing, in effect, that our whole notion of a free society, of all of the freedoms that are accorded to, universally to human beings, particularly in the United States through founding documents like the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, other such social contracts, you might call them, are really predicated only upon the notion of white rights and the universal spirit and animation of white life. And I think it's very interesting to think about the way in which all of that gets prescribed, and so that the struggle for non-white people is always to be included into this framework of universality, always to be struggling to be recognized within this, this polity. This is, I think, an interesting way of theorizing about the internet, which the internet has also been articulated and rendered a space of freedom and possibility, building on this kind of ethos, this American ethos of so-called inclusion. So in the nascent work that I'm sharing today, based on the framings I've just articulated, I'm looking at internet media spectacles. And again, this is building on the previous analysis of the circulation of images of Trayvon Martin to include other victims of state violence, including Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, among many others. This research is needed to historically contextualize how social media fosters symbolic death and post-traumatic stress. Developing a political economy of media spectacles online can help uncover the ways in which that digital technologies traffic in Black death because it is incredibly profitable, both offline and on. And I just wrote a whole book about trafficking and the pornification and misogyny and racism of Black women and girls, and now I'm extending this to think about other types of representations of Black people online. By tracing the ways that Black and African Americans are represented and trafficked, I'm attempting to reveal a complex layering of silences. The silences of those who cannot control the ways in which they are represented at the level of group identity, and by that I mean victims and their families, for example. The silences of the overwhelming majority of people who are unaware of the ways in which they are represented and are shaping public opinion, and the silences of the companies who do not engage with the civic impact of the ways in which they profit from the media spectacle of Black people dead and dying. We need to better understand the messages encoded in the spectacle, and I'm working to theorize the effects of the circulation of Black death through social media and the emotional consequences that are exacerbated by digital technologies, to challenge the notion that surveillance footage can be a means of change when the prevailing spectacle is one of profiting from the pain of Black people, with no remedy or restitution or reparation. And I see each of these as essential to a term that I'm thinking about now and kind of arguing for a heightened critical surveillance literacy, which I'll also talk about today. And let me just say a bit about this image. So here you have the most popular video search on the keywords Eric Garner, which has, you can see banner advertisement for home buy, right across the video itself. A whole series of kind of ads and videos that YouTube wants you to click on, especially. So even to kind of have an unfettered view of this video of Eric Garner, you have to engage with the advertisement. And YouTube's entire platform and Google's platform, I often argue Google search, which has primarily been the site of most of my research, is not an internet, it's not an information retrieval platform, it's a commercial advertising platform. And so YouTube, by extension, its property, also forces engagement with advertising. And it really, if you think about the logics behind this in terms of who might the intended viewer be of a video about Eric Garner, maybe somebody who's looking to buy a house. And when I'm collecting these videos, I'm often trying to have a variety of different people collecting them or collecting these kinds of videos on computers without a lot of digital traces, just to try to see who's trying to capitalize on these videos. The circulation and consumption of traumatic images is a major issue facing members of the public who use the internet. Black African Americans are subject to persistent media and internet spectacles through the hyper-circulation of murders and traumas through multiple forms of state and corporate violence. An in-depth exploration of internet media spectacles, including an analysis of the circulation of images of Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Alton Sterling, Corinne Gaines, Philandro Castile, among others, is really needed to historically contextualize how social media fosters symbolic death. And understanding this is really important. The implications of these online practices and the records of Black death that are generated and shared are profound in their consequences. Videos that circulate in multinational media platforms that feature Black death and dying are a type of commercial property that works in service of whiteness and the consolidation of white power, even while working simultaneously to raise consciousness and awareness of the differential status and lack of justice for Black people in the United States. And here I consider the work of Cheryl Harris, UCLA professor of law and critical race theorist, who wrote an important piece in 1996 called Whiteness is Property. Viral videos work simultaneously as surveillance technologies, which are often rooted in an emancipatory logic of free-flowing information and a right to see and circulate, a right typically over-afforded to white Americans. In this way, surveillance technologies and multinational internet communications platforms work in service of the protection of property for the wealthy. So this whole economy is really about who can circulate videos, who benefits from these videos. So here again, when you search on news stories in Google on the keywords Eric Garner, this was just a few months ago, it opens with an advertisement for Cisco and an Amazon banner ad, right? So again, who's buying a Cisco server? that as a gateway, right, as a presupposition for understanding more about Eric Garner. Viral images often become the property of these companies, and the social media of Black life is hyper-surveilled by the state, including local law enforcement and federal agencies. The ACLU's latest report, issued on October 11th of 2016, corroborates the testimony of many Black activists about the ways that law enforcement surveilled activists in Baltimore and Black Lives Matter activists working in Ferguson, Missouri, using Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram with metadata provided to them from Geofedia, a social media monitoring software. Previously, I've characterized these technological surveillance encroachments in my research on Google Glass by asserting Harris's position that, quote, the normalization of the other is a product of the ways in which white property, white interests, and even whiteness itself can and should be protected at all costs. Trafficking in Black death and dying, including resistance movements that call for justice in the face of it, does not preclude using these images as commodity or clickbait. This is part of the troubling landscape of digital media platforms. So these images, while they may be the property of the family, they also now work as property in YouTube or property of Google, and they work in service of generating more advertising and profit revenue to Google, and that's part of the point that I want to make here. And this right to the ways in which internet platforms are structured such that their owners and their shareholders have a right to these videos and have a right to profit because of the way in which those platforms are designed. This is part of the troubling landscape of digital media platforms, as I mentioned. As Tanya Sutherland has recently written, if archives as memory institutions are collectively mandated to create, maintain, use, and make available records of a shared national history, where then is the evidence of this difficult past? If social media are and I add to that, if social media are serving as archives, which is debatable, I will say. I'm certainly not arguing that the internet writ large is an archive. But then in whose interest is the platform operating to generate evidence in the interest of political, social, and economic justice? We know that videos and photos existed in the deaths of Oscar Grant and Corinne Gaines, yet citizen-produced records have not had the same legitimacy as other forms of records generated by the state, and are therefore often considered suspect by legal state-sanctioned arbiters of justice. So we need a better understanding of the cultural importance of trafficking in the spectacle of Black death on the internet by looking at how often and to what profit Black death as a viral phenomenon is exponentially potent and traumatizing. In so doing, my research corrects the widespread misconception of digital media platforms as neutral technologies, value-free, and absolved of the social meanings and ideas they put forth. I posit that decisions made by online media giants are driven by profit at the expense of women and people of color, whose images and cultural markers are often sold to the highest bidders, as in the case of Cisco, literally through the auctioning of keywords and selling of advertisements on top of or in relation to viral images of Black death. We also need to think about whether digital circulations of Black death exacerbate mental and emotional health crises for the communities who are the targets of violence vis-a-vis hyper-policing and increased surveillance. The investments in so-called remedies or new records of abuse through surveillance footage only obscure our ability to challenge digital technologies and the alleged liberatory narratives that surround them. Little research has been conducted yet on the long-term relationship between social media use and PTSD among African Americans. A recent dissertation by Morgan Maxwell in 2016 found that while Facebook and other social networking sites have been viewed as safe spaces for young African Americans to release their frustrations about American racism, findings from this study reveal SNS's increased perceptions of racism and subsequently influence expressions of anger, anticipatory body alarm response, and general stress. To the extent that these outcomes can collectively impact the health of African Americans, social media use may be more maladaptive to young African Americans than previously thought. Exposure to social media, while an effective means of discussing issues of race, and as Andre Brock from the University of Michigan here has noted, allows for everyday libidinal responses that celebrate and reframe Blackness. Yet it is also likely to increase stress and anger because of the increased exposure to racism and racist content. We see this in the experience of being exposed to the virality of Black death and dying without consent, which often happens on Facebook, Twitter, as well as in YouTube. So this idea that you're on Facebook and a video shows up in your feed, and whether you want to see it or not, it's there. It's kind of thrust upon you, maybe by your friends or people who are trying to share. Who then benefits from the circulation of images of Black people dead and dying on the web? I believe these work in service of maintaining the racial contract that Mills argues. So that, again, this presupposition that we are free to engage in these online platforms, even that we're free to not engage. My students don't really have much choice to not be on the internet if they want to be successful in the university. So these ideas that we're free and that there isn't a differential impact of these freedoms is part of what I'm trying to look at. The incidence of anxiety disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, has been understudied over time among African Americans due to a number of factors that include reduced incidences of reporting through psychiatric and psychological services, differential manifestations of anxiety disorders, and the small number of researchers investigating trauma among Black people. One effect of PTSD for African Americans in the context of structural and individual experiences of violence is internalized racism, making anxiety a prolonged experience that may need longer-term interventions. What we need are better understandings of what circulation of images that represent death and dying of African Americans through social media is doing, and whether it is indeed contributing to the recently declared public health crisis called racism. This work is yet to be done. This was noted, however, on August 20th of 2015, when Gene Demby, a noted African-American journalist, was interviewed for National Public Radio's Morning Edition show about the story he wrote for Code Switch on the emotional and psychological tolls experienced by African-American reporters covering Black death in the media. As a journalist for NPR, Demby covers race and policing and is inundated with tweets through social media from people with stories and details about the killings of Black people, particularly through state-sanctioned police violence. He detailed the ways that Black journalists are incredibly challenged to create psychic distance between the subject matter of covering murdered African Americans and their own lived realities of being potential victims themselves, or for those they know, of police profiling and murder. Demby said that the overwhelming responsibility to cover the stories of racial inequality take a toll on Black journalists, particularly for those who feel the need to be truthful in the coverage of how African Americans are policed. His story brings to the fore the ways that journalistic objectivity is mediated through the lens of whiteness in the newsroom and is portrayed as a kind of alleged neutrality and objectivity when it is anything but. In his story for Code Switch, he shares the experience of, quote, double vision that Black reporters share. He says, a couple of other reporters I talked to for the story expressed that concern, not being able to do justice to every story, every hashtag, every lost life. In terms of taking care of myself, Wes told me, we're 1 year in, I need to take some time off, and I haven't. Part of the fatigue he described was similar to something Tremaine told me, dealing with the double vision of seeing yourself or someone you love in the story of, whoa, you're out there reporting. Wes grew up in suburban Cleveland, and he and his brothers hung out near the park where 12-year-old Tamir Rice was killed by a cop last winter. He remembers first dealing with that double vision during the Trayvon Martin case. I was a light-skinned Black man walking around in a hoodie buying candy from convenience stores in a sketchy suburban neighborhood every single day of my upbringing, he said. How many nights was I dressed the exact same way he was, doing the exact same thing he was doing? Demby's interviewee articulates a double vision of seeing yourself or someone you love in the story of, whoa, you're out there reporting, and how the repeated investigating of the viral images and details of Black death take their toll on African American journalists. And so in this work, I'm trying to theorize the effects of the circulation of Black death through social media and the emotional consequences that are exacerbated by digital technologies. Demby's coverage of Black reporters affected the trauma of bombardments of the murders and demonstrates how racism in the United States operates as a system of incapacitating social inequalities. with state-sanctioned death functioning as a penultimate manifestation of racist violence. The mass circulation of these videos, photographs, and records of violence against African Americans is a new phenomenon bolstered by the virality of the digital network and is an important site of study. We need to think about whether digital circulations of Black death exacerbate mental and emotional health crises for the communities who are the targets of violence vis-a-vis hyper-policing and increased surveillance. Now, racism can manifest on many levels, from interpersonal attitudes and interactions that are biased and prejudicial to social structural organization that foster discrimination and access to resources such as jobs, education, power, and symbolic representation. Studies show that African Americans are more likely to experience stress and anxiety due to multiple forms of racial discrimination and prolonged exposure to racism at the cultural and institutional levels. Nobody wants us talking about these things today. I'll say that.
Speak that truth.
It's all right. Just stay with me.
I'll get it.
No problem.
Paul, I will just say that there are intermittent power outages across the campus.
Okay, this is the same.
So we are not alone.
Great.
Okay, but we can still get it reset.
I'll describe to you.
Well, there's an uninterrupted power supply up there of some sort.
All right.
Yeah, it has its locked door though, so I got
Yeah.
Studies show that African Americans are more likely to experience stress and anxiety due to multiple forms of racial discrimination and prolonged exposure to racism at the cultural and institutional levels. The circulation of videos of Black people dead and dying, particularly at the hands of the state, no doubt contribute to these stressors. Little research, as I mentioned, has been conducted in this space, and I think that these are some of the things that we need to be thinking through. All right. Who then benefits from the circulation of images of Black people dead and dying on the web? Myths of a digital democracy premised on a technocratic colorblindness emerge key to perpetuating gender and racial exclusions and to the tone deafness in Silicon Valley that consistently seeks to disavow itself of racist technological practices. Measures made on the basis of valuations, ability to attract investors, acquisitions, and bank account balances. And I'm writing a book right now with Sarah Roberts called Silicon Valley Values. And it's about the kind of dimensions of Silicon Valley's investment in particular themes of the social order or the social contract, full liberties, except where all those things actually completely fall apart in the face of race and gender projects. So I would be showing you now a slide that has a search on the most popular searches on Eric Garner, which you saw before. So just imagine those images here of the Cisco video and the home buy ads on top of Eric Garner's the video of his death. Jesse Daniels wrote a powerful piece examining the way colorblind ideology operates in Silicon Valley in 2015 and across the internet, where she reminds us of how race and racism are embedded in the culture and practices of digital technologies writ large. In this work, she details the ways that whiteness is embedded in the architectures of the web, from master and slave drives to deep social inequality among technology workers from the global north to the global south. She points to the investments made in middle class and affluent immigrant labor, for example, at the expense of Black and Latino employment, because it is these investments that are consistent with the mythology of the United States as a land of opportunity, and thus eschewing charges of bias in hiring and promotion. Under the current conditions that drive digital media platforms like Google Search, which I've previously written about at length, and properties of its parent company, Alphabet, companies like YouTube or Google Maps, many of these and their histories and identities are many communities that are written into these platforms are robbed of their histories and identities, or at least at a minimum they're held hostage to the profitability schemes of the spectacle. And I want to challenge the idea that records will serve as an arbiter of justice, as if online records or documents are a matter of objective fact. I argue that alongside this, social media is often critically uncritically celebrated as a mechanism for knowing, as if there were not a more than 300-year US history of making visible the dead bodies of African people as a signifier of white power. We often hear people say things like, if we didn't have these videos, we wouldn't know. Even though the reality of other offline practices, such as lynching, has served as a form of offline social communication in families, neighborhoods, communities, cities, and at the hands of the state and everyday white American civic leaders. I'm also concerned about the logic and harm caused by our reliance upon large corporations to feed us information that ultimately leads us somewhere, often to places unexpected and unintended. Of course, the recent US presidential election might be a good example of that. In the case of web results communicating erroneous, false, or downright private information that one would otherwise not want perceived as the official record of the self in Google, the effects of which can be devastating. A difficult aspect of challenging group versus individual representations online is that there are no protections or basis for action under the current legal regime. Public records of which web results can be included, whether organized by the state or vis-a-vis corporations, work in service of a privatized public good. Google and other large monopolies in the information communications technology sector have a responsibility to communities in as much as they do individuals. Currently, there is key legislation that challenges Google's records of information it provides about individuals, much of which is being discussed through legislative reforms like the right to be forgotten policies in the European Union, and new laws in the US are emerging around revenge porn, for example. But we don't have these kinds of ways of intervening legally in the United States over the ways that people at a community level are represented or misrepresented or engaged with writ large. Certainly viral videos are important records. They're cultural markers and sources of commodification too, that bolster white supremacy in service of the consolidated political power. Sarah Roberts' work on content moderation helps recast these projects. And so one of the things, let me just say kind of preemptively here, this is the same Sarah that I'm writing a book with now. One of the things that we talk about is how, for example, videos, if you were to do a search, this slide that I would have up right now would be a search on Mike Brown, and it would bring down an auto-suggest screen on top of a video, and the auto-suggestions are things like autopsy, death, kind of a host of auto-suggestions that don't signify maybe the things that Mike Brown's family would want him to be remembered as. So it's not, Mike Brown as a son, Mike Brown as a community member, Mike Brown as a friend. It's the titillating kind of salacious Mike Brown that can serve as a clickbait for people to click on and click through videos. And this is the distinction that I'm trying to make. And in my previous work, I've also talked about how is it that kind of the most pornified, sexually objectifying images of women and girls of color comes through because it also works in this kind of salacious way, right? Rather than the way Black children who are girls would want to be represented. They're not represented kind of through the agency of their own maybe shared group identity. Now part of that happens because there are people, there was software and human beings who are engaged in commercial content moderation, which determines kind of which things make it through into the platform and which things are left out. So she says about this kind of content moderation, she says, yet things are not quite so simple. Questions remain about the moral and ethical implications of videos of this kind of content, driving millions of views to a commercial profit-driven site. As I rewatched some of the upsetting videos described in this article in preparation for its writing, she wrote a chapter for a book that I recently edited called The Intersectional Internet. She says, I noted that a number of them were preceded by commercial advertising. Views for some of them are in the hundreds of millions. And Google, the parent company of YouTube, is currently trading at over $535 per share. Simply put, the decision for what stays up and what comes down must at some level be a monetary one. And of course, in her work, she's looked at things like, she's interviewed these commercial content moderators about the policies that they have to use to determine what kinds of content makes it into the platform. And these moderators ask questions like, why is it that the animal killing videos, the videos of harming animals don't make it in, we have to keep those out, but blackface makes it in, right? Because blackface is profitable. These tensions need to be taken up by and for communities and groups, particularly marginalized racial minorities in the United States and abroad, whose collective experiences, rights, and representations are not sufficiently protected online. Search results are records, and the records of human activity are a matter of tremendous contestation. They are a battleground over the identity, control, and what constitutes legitimate knowledge. Records in the form of websites and their visibility are power. Ultimately, the challenges facing both individuals and communities in Google's products are not sufficiently protected and need the attention of legislators in the United States. Because if we revisit the notion of the record and its source of legitimation, publicly generated records of Black death and dying are often not legible in the convicting of those who harm or murder Black people. Indeed, the proximity of the recording practice, its legitimation by the record maker and the record keepers, is over-determined by proximity to power and property rights. And I believe this is set up and bolstered by the racial contract. Who has the right to be in charge and who has to struggle to be recognized within that framework. Here I would have a slide for you of a couple of images from withoutsanctuary.org, which we've seen this morning, and I know we'll see again today. There's two images of 3 men who've been lynched. In the case of lynching records vis-a-vis commercial postcards and memorabilia, as represented in this image, one of the images is a framed, matted photograph with hair of the victim kind of enclosed in the matted frame as kind of a very kind of what people might make as like a shadow box of their special souvenir or their special memorabilia that they want to keep and hang on a wall in a prominent place in their home. In the case of lynching records vis-a-vis commercial postcards and memorabilia, the faces and even names of white citizens can be fully documented, yet never be used as evidence that would lead to conviction for their participation in the spectacle of murdering Black people. Here are some important examples of online archives and their intervention, and I'm talking about a couple of these images, as I mentioned, from Without Sanctuary, which are graphic reminders of the not-so-distant past, a past that has recently been called for in the political imaginary of making America great again. In the first picture that I'm showing is the corpse of Clyde Johnson from August 3rd, 1935 in Eureka, California. It's a gelatin silver print and a real photo postcard that's 3.5 by 5 3/8. Etched in the negative, it says, "Killer of Jack Daw, August 3rd, 1935, vengeance in Siskiyou County." Now, metadata from Without Sanctuary says that, quote, at the funeral of Dunsmuir, Oregon's chief of police, F.R. Daw, a number of mourners planned on the lynching of his alleged murderer, Clyde Johnson. Early on the morning of August 3rd, 1935, the masked mob, estimated as large as 50, forcibly removed Johnson from his jail cell and dragged him 3 miles south of town where they hung him from a pine tree. Local and state officials expressed mixed reaction to the news of the lynching. District Attorney James Davis declared that he would open an investigation and, quote, do everything the law requires to apprehend members of the mob. On the other hand, the California Attorney General, referring to the recently delayed execution of an accused murderer, stated that the, quote, uncontrollable unrest was a natural result of the apathy of the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, in the second image that I mentioned here, that's the shadow box with the hair, we have the lynching of Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith, a large gathering of lynchers, August 7th, 1930, Marion, Indiana. It's a gelatin silver print, a copy photo. The frame is 11 by 9, the photo 3 7/8 by 2 3/4. Inscribed in pencil on the inner gray mat, it says, quote, Bo pointing to his nigger. On the yellowed outer mat, It says Klan, 4th Joplin, Missouri, 33. Flattened between the glass and the double mats are locks of the victim's hair. Metadata from Without Sanctuary says, quote, a short man with a Hitler mustache points to the body of Abram Smith. On his inner arm is tattooed the bust of an Indian woman. Indiana historians and researchers are interviewing the reluctant Marion citizens old enough to remember the lynching of Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith. One of the goals is to identify the individuals in this disturbing photo, not to demonize them, but to better understand the factors that produced such a violent and tyrannical era. No one knows who Bo was. Again, I think it's interesting, this idea of even the inquiry not to demonize the killers. This is the type of memorabilia many people kept in their homes, and I believe it's analogous to the kind of internet memorabilia that circulates now through social media and multinational internet media companies. You know, you have to go back, and I hearken to this quote by Mills, where he says, what kind of consciousness does it take? What must be prescribed through social interactions, through laws, through a particular kind of racial order, that the normalization of lynching, the taking of one's children out to celebrate, the sharing of a meal under a body hanging from a tree, that takes a particular consciousness, and this was not so long ago. And so I think this is something that we have to interrogate, again, as the racial logics that underlie our society, and of course, the many projects that we produce within it. Now let us fast forward to other records that exist in the public imaginary. We know, for example, that creators of video evidence or records in the informational sense are legitimated by the state or not. A clear case of the disavowal of the truth of records is the video evidence recorded by Ramsey Orta, who filmed the death of Eric Garner by NYPD, only to have his own criminal record that included gun and drug charges used as a means of incarcerating him for up to 4 years. Orta's documenting of the death of Garner did not serve to convict those who killed Garner, but did generate significant web traffic for news outlets covering the story. Indeed, it is not reported as one of the most important, it is reported as one of the most important and iconic viral videos to ever be recorded, but in service again of whom? The record is both real in its materiality and its commercial value, while simultaneously an imagined means of justice within a legal framework. Recording a particular truth with a focus on evidence has been the central focus of the move toward the call for increased use of police body cameras. The dominant media course of police body cameras suggests that these new state-controlled technologies, which are embedded with a number of problematic assumptions, will be an objective arbiter of truth. Stacey Woods, in her new work on body cameras, says, quote, the body-worn camera shifts the onus of transparency and accountability from the police themselves and relocates it in a technological object. In this way, the cameras also operate as tools for controlling the emotional state and outcry of the public. Instead of indictments for individual police officers or strategies for significant structural change, we have a $75 million investment in a technological solution that is in and of itself considered enough. So I want to turn back here as I start to close to look at the records of the internet and the platforms that control and profit from the surveillance and citizen vote videos. The virality of Black Death and Dying demands that we study and make the calls for greater surveillance of communities through police body cameras and their circulation through popular social media. It really demands that we kind of pause and assess. The goal of this kind of research could be to cultivate a better understanding of how identity is in dialectical tension between struggles for social justice and the privatized neoliberal models of media ownership that circulate Black Death in relationship to the selling of products and services by U.S. corporations. This is part of our surveillance literacy then, our ways of knowing, and our ability to develop strategies that help us recuperate from the losses of life, rather than have these videos and images continue to be fodder for the justification of our annihilation. I conclude that videos that circulate in multinational media platforms of Black Death and Dying is a type of commercial property that really works in service of consolidating power, and even if it simultaneously is raising consciousness and awareness. And I think the speaker before me really helped illuminate the ways in which we don't need videos to know about the legacies and oral histories that are passed down in our families and communities. We don't need the videos to circulate through CNN and for CNN to make $1 million off that video in order for us to know about the violence of white supremacy. It's here that as I conclude, that I want to end and foreground my call for critical surveillance literacy online. I'm building upon the work of Tyson Lewis, who has theorized in the context of students in schools. He says that critical surveillance literacy is a specialized form of Paulo Freire's critical literacy, focusing explicitly on technologies, discourses, and practices of surveillance in a post-Columbine and post-9/11 world. I think that this is also informed not only by internet practices that situate Black death and dying as a commodity subject, but also includes a revisiting of the historical practices of literacy and epistemology among Black people in the USA and the US. A critical literacy of dead bodies and the images of such have been used both in service of bolstering white supremacy and in the commodification of Black death, which has generated strategies of reading and knowing about structures and practices of surveillance and control of Black people's lives. As I've written before, what the spectacle of mass media has failed to do yet is help us reframe our ability to talk about race, power, and privilege in the long view. This requires learned people who have studied history, critical theories of race, feminism, and power. It requires expertise and commitment to help us contextualize race in the United States, and it takes intentional reframing. It does not lend itself to a 24/7 news cycle with 10-minute news segments, nor to internet memes. We must continue to interrogate how the spectacle swallows whole the story and spits back little to dismantle systems of violence. This political economy of the virality of Black death and dying demands that we think about the ways that multinational media platforms are profiting. And I'm sorry that I can't show you this slide that has kind of these core tenets of this critical surveillance literacy online that I'm working now to publish. But I would just say that it has kind of 4 key tenets that we need to be thinking about as we move forward and think about the internet and social media in the context of critical surveillance literacy online. One is that we directly engage the role of capitalism in defining the relations of power on the internet and by extension into archives and memory organizations. A critical surveillance literacy online accounts for the racialization and gendering of bodies based on the racial contract as the basis of social control. It also engages in resistance of hyper-surveillance through collective struggle that knits together activism and broader anti-military, anti-capital struggles, and here I'm directly kind of including the words of Tyson. And critical surveillance literacy engages in critiques and resistance of surveillance through commodification projects and exploitation on the internet, as I've tried to show here in this talk today. Thank you.